everyone, welcome to the Dyl Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo, and welcome to a series of videos that I call 2023 Catch-Up. I'm basically going to be talking about all the films that I want to talk about that I haven't talked about that you all have been asking about, and some of them were on my most anticipated of 2023 list, some films that I have been wanting to get around to, and some films that I didn't even expect to seek out that people recommended to me, I saw and I loved. And two of the films that I'm going to be talking about on today's video are part of that bubble. The first video is kind of a package video of a bunch of different films that I saw because they all fall under a similar umbrella, and that is January horror. The thing with January horror is in previous years, January seems to be the dumping ground for all the studio schlock. Basically, the studios, they have all their films and they say, you know what, these are the things that we're not confident in making money, or we don't think are going to be huge critical successes, or they're just long installments of a long running franchise. This is where a lot of the Insidious sequels and Paranormal Activity sequels, the Grudge remake, a lot of them were thrown in January. And a lot of those films don't get well received. They're not very popular. They're not very big financial money makers. That's why they drop them in January. But in the past few years, we've been seeing that January horror, the kind of stigma of January horror, has kind of gone by the wayside. And we've been seeing some great films coming out in January. Last year, Scream 2022 came out in January, and it was a big hit. And a lot of people liked it, so much so that there's a new Scream in theaters now. So I really do think January horror is getting better. And there were actually 4 films that came out in January that were horror films that got pretty good reception and good buzz. So I'm going to be talking about 4 of them today. The 4 films we're going to be talking about today are M3GAN, Skinamarink, Sick, and Infinity Pool. Infinity Pool was my most anticipated film for January of 2023, so I wanted to also make a video on that separately, but I didn't have the time to, so I figured why not package them all together, because I think in some way these are all successes. I didn't like all these films. There's one film I didn't really like, but they've either really profited well, considering what their budgets have been, or they become massive audience favorites, or they've just been getting really genuinely good reviews, and people should seek them out. So I'm really excited to talk about these 4 films, but let's start with probably the most popular one, and that is M3GAN. This is actually the one, spoiler alert, that I liked the least of these 4, and this is a film that was very interesting because you look at the trailer and it almost kind of looks like a joke. It's about this one girl who loses her parents in a car accident that happens very early on. Sorry if that's a spoiler, but she has to live with her aunt. Her aunt doesn't really know how to take care of her because no one really knows how to take care of someone that's A, grieving in that way, but B, when you don't have kids and you don't have this preparation to have a family, it's a lot thrown on you. And Allison Williams' character plays that aunt, having to take this girl in, but she really struggles to connect with her in more ways than one, but ends up, because she has a profession in building new toys and just in inventing things and robotics and AI and all that, builds her basically an AI friend named M3GAN with a 3, M3GAN. And I really do think that is a really good inciting incident. It kind of reminds me of the Child's Play movies. You get this companion, and then the companion turns out to be this serial killer, this psycho killer.
Stop! Don't! M3GAN! You should probably run.
And it kind of goes that route. It goes the Child's Play route. And I love Child's Play. It's one of my favorite horror movies of the 80s. I really, really like Child's Play. I think the difference with M3GAN is that it's trying 2 things. It's trying to bring a lot of modern sensibilities in the use of technology and just the discussion on technology and the use of showing technology and how it relates to children, and how children, the whole idea that children shouldn't be so married to technology, and that society itself shouldn't be so married to technology because it could harm us. And I think that message is very clear. If anything, it maybe felt like they were beating us over the head too much with that message, to where it felt a little bit overindulgent. And I would have been fine with that if also M3GAN kind of committed to being this kind of like crazy camp masterpiece. And I do think a lot of people have been seeing it as a camp masterpiece, as like something that's so silly and campy and ridiculous fun. But I think the thing with campy movies, to me, the best movies that are camp are movies that are maybe a little less self-aware. I feel like M3GAN is almost too self-aware, to where they're trying almost to be cheesy and trying to be bad essentially at certain points. Like they're in on the joke. And I think sometimes the best camp masterpieces are the movies that are intended with the best intentions, but sometimes fall a little short, but are still admirable because they tried so hard to be successful in what they are. I mean, you think of some of the best movies we've covered on Frame Wreck, the show Matt Chapman and I do, where we talk about so bad they're good movies. And a lot of the most endearing bad movies are the ones where the directors thought they were making something masterful. I mean, look at The Room. Tommy Wiseau thought he was making a masterpiece. Here with M3GAN, I think everyone knows they're making a purposefully campy, bad cult movie. And I think because of that, there's a little charm lost. It almost feels a little too glossy because it's also under the studio umbrella. The studio is making this film to where it feels almost a little too shiny. I get it deals with technology and modern advancement and all that stuff. So maybe that was the intention, to make it look a little too glossy and shiny. But I would have liked this to be a little rougher around the edges, considering what it is.
Experts say...
M3GAN, turn off.
I thought we were having a conversation.
That being said, there are some fun moments. There are some fun scares. I like this more as a comedy than I did a horror film. It didn't really scare me at all. Some of the horror beats were a little predictable. Like, you knew where the film was going the whole time, and you probably knew where the film was ending the whole time, because when you have something like this that has the potential to become an audience breakout, which it did, there's some sequel setup that I think was a little obvious. But I do still like elements of M3GAN. It just wasn't something I was obsessing over. But then again, my sister loves this movie. My family loves this movie. So I do think it's found its audience. So that's a really big success, even if I wasn't necessarily the biggest fan of it. Moving on now to a film called Skinamarink. And for the purposes of this review, I'm just going to turn this down and turn that down as well. And you know what? I'm going to turn the brightness on this thing down as well. So Skinamarink, I'm going to talk about Skinamarink this way, because Skinamarink, I'm going to lean into the mic for this one, actually, because Skinamarink is this. This is the vibe of Skinamarink. It's very minimally shot, very minimally lit. It's very grainy. The grain on the camera is the entire aesthetic. What Skinamarink is, I might as well tell you what it is, because it's one of the more underseen films. Skinamarink basically shows the story of this kid who is looking for his dad, and then his dad seemingly disappears, and he finds out that he's alone in his house, and some of the doors to his house and some of the windows start to basically disappear, to where he really has no escape, and he's trapped in this house with some lingering threat that I won't really spoil what that threat is. But the beauty of Skinamarink is the fact that it is all entirely on its tone, on its style. It is not a plot forward movie. If you go into it expecting a plot forward movie, you're probably going to be disappointed. I went into it just not really knowing what to expect, except for hearing from other people that it's really, really scary. But I think even other people downplayed this, because this was probably the scariest movie I've ever seen in theaters. And I don't want to feel like I'm exaggerating, but I'm not. Like, I was legitimately frightened the entire time. And it's because the way the camera's set up, these directors have set up the cameras in really interesting angles that you don't normally see in cinema. A lot of it's shot from the floor, where you're at the perspective of the rug of the house, where you only see the feet, you only hear the voices. The use of sound is very interesting as well, when you hear these voices and whose voices you hear, and at what pitches, what intervals, what volumes, which intensities you hear these voices.
In this house.
And you're meant to feel a little bit of a sense of confusion, because this is essentially more so than a story. It is kind of just an embodiment of what a nightmare would be. Because when you think of your dreams and your nightmares, I don't know many people who can recite their dreams or nightmares from beginning to end. It's kind of that thing when you wake up from a dream or nightmare, you kind of hazily try to remember it, and little bits and fragments and pieces kind of come to light. That's what Skinamarink feels like. It feels like someone's nightmare, after they wake up and they're able to kind of recount it in their head, these little fragments of moments and bits and pieces. And a lot of it is just sitting around waiting for stuff to happen, and just kind of soaking in the atmosphere, and not knowing what's around the corner, but knowing that there's something looming around. And I really, really love that about this film. This is a film I never want to see again, because it scared the absolute crap out of me. And it's also a film I never want to see again, because it does take time and patience that I don't know if you necessarily can have when you rewatch this. It's something that feels like once you know what beats are coming, I don't know if it's going to be as successful, and I don't want to lose that charm. But that's not to say it's not a good movie that I never want to watch it again. In fact, it's my favorite movie of the four we're talking about because it is so unique. It has such a distinct vision. I really am a fan of when directors or filmmakers are trying to push the genre and the medium forward. And I do think this pushes the film medium forward. It does push the genre forward because it feels one of a kind. It feels like something that hasn't been done before. And I love how it kind of puts you in this nightmare mindset and doesn't really reveal where it's going. You can't predict where it's going. And when that final shot comes, and I'm not even going to say what it is, but if you've seen it, you know what I mean. That final shot is perhaps the scariest shot I've seen in cinema. So Skinamarink is a huge, huge recommendation if you want to get your pants scared off. But I also want to warn you because it is so different. It's not going to be for everyone. Some people are going to be like, that was the most boring hour and a half of my life. But I think if you put yourself in a certain mindset and are just able to kind of like be patient and go with the flow, I think you can get a lot out of it because it is unlike anything I've ever seen before. The next film we're going to be talking about is a Peacock original called Sick. This is probably the less seen film of the bunch. Even Skinamarink, which not many people saw, made so much money back from its budget to where it was such a financial success. Sick feels like a movie that not really many people are talking about, and they should be talking about because I think it's really, really solid. Sick is directed by John Hyams, who just directed Alone a few years ago, a really nice, tight little horror thriller. And he's back in the director's chair alongside Kevin Williamson, who wrote the original Scream movies, writing this film. And there's definitely that Kevin Williamson vibe in the way the characters talk to one another. It feels very relatable.
Mary.
Jump in, water's fine. Who is this?
I don't know.
That's creepy, Parker.
But they don't show their hand too early. You know, you don't really know where this film is going 100% of the time. It actually, for a while, wasn't hooking me in because it felt like kind of a rote slasher film. It's about these people. They're in the midst of the pandemic, which is another thing. This is one of the only really horror-centric pandemic-centric horror films that we've seen so far come out of the pandemic. But it's about these friends who are in the pandemic, and this one girl decides to go with her friend to quarantine at her cabin in the woods. And then they're just in the cabin in the woods, and then an invader comes and tries to kill them. And it becomes almost like your rote slasher film where these girls have to battle against this person who's in their house. And honestly, I was a little underwhelmed at first because I was like, this is kind of every other slasher. I was a little disappointed because I was like, this is a perfect way to use the pandemic as a horror device and show the terrors of walking through the grocery store with a mask and having to worry that every corner you get sick. And I really liked that idea that they kind of had in the first 5 minutes and then kind of abandoned when it just became a cabin in the woods movie. I'm like, oh, so now they're just quarantining in the cabin in the woods. So the whole pandemic thing is thrown out the window. I was like, there goes the inventiveness. But I ate my words at the end because at the end, once you figure out who the killer or killers are and what the motive is, it kind of makes everything kind of come full circle, and it totally makes you change your opinion on the movie if you thought it was this rote slasher film. It was a rote slasher film with some cool kills, but then as the film went on, the kills got more inventive, and the actual story and the motive of the killer got so much more inspired and made me really, really dig this film. I'm really, really impressed with what Kevin Williamson did with the script, with what John Hyams did with the direction. It's really interesting because Kevin Williamson comes from that horror background, but John Hyams comes from the more action-centric background. So it's really cool to see the marriage of sensibilities between horror and action take place here. And eventually, by the end, the COVID pandemic storyline, it really does kind of come into focus. It's just something that wasn't necessarily there 100% of the way. And that's something I unfortunately misjudged the film on. I thought it was a film that was just using COVID merely as a setup, but it really makes more sense once the film is finally completed why the COVID pandemic storyline was such an important integral piece of the story, because you never want to feel like you're just using this horrible traumatic thing, the pandemic and COVID, just as a plot device. And that's what I was annoyed about. But it's not just a plot device. It actually works in function with the story.
Oh my God! Just one moment. Unlock the door! Unlock the door! You have a mask, don't you?
So I think this is a really good one. I think there's some really gnarly kills in this thing too, that if you're just a fan of slashers because of the kills and the brutality, you're definitely going to dig this one. So it's on Peacock. Go check it out. It's actually on Peacock with M3GAN, so you can do a double feature. I recommend ending with this because this has a more cathartic ending, I think. So it really is a really interesting, really nice little slasher film. Nothing groundbreaking, but definitely better than I was giving it credit for until the end scenes happened. And finally, we're going to be talking about Infinity Pool, which was my most anticipated film of January, my most anticipated horror film of the year. And it is directed by Brandon Cronenberg, son of David Cronenberg. And I really liked Brandon Cronenberg's last film, Possessor. It's the only film of his I've seen, but I really dug it for its practical effects, for its body horror, for its inventive plot. And I think Infinity Pool, sorry, it's not a Marvel film. Infinity Pool borrows a lot of that great stuff that we saw in Possessor in terms of the story building, the world building. This film focuses on this couple as Alexander Skarsgård's character is going into this kind of vacation to cure his writer's block. And that's kind of a cliche way to present a film and start a character arc, is to say, oh, I have writer's block. Like, it's kind of a lazy place to start, but I think they do kind of go in a more creative fashion because eventually you start to see that this island is a little different than he once expected. They are told not to leave the resort grounds, and you find out why that is because as they kind of venture out from the resort grounds, there's a murder that is accidentally committed. And in this island, in this world that this film lives in, when you commit an act of violence or a criminal act or any act really that is worth jail time, instead of jail time, you can have a clone of yourself made and then have that clone of yourself executed for what you did. But the whole caveat is that you have to watch your clone die. So, and your clone kind of possesses all the same feelings and memories that you do as well. It's a really effed up premise. I mean, the idea that you have to watch your clone suffer, and what does that do to the human soul to watch that happen? Does it make you more fearful of the things you do in life, or does it make you kind of lean into that, knowing that there is another world where you can get away with everything as long as this cloned version of yourself dies? It's a really messed up and twisted premise that I think for the first like 45 minutes really had me. It was really making me anxious and giving me all the feels that a horror film should. And I really think the brutality and the gore in this thing was really, really good. But then about 45 minutes in, for some reason, it hit like this wall where I was waiting for it to kind of go that extra mile. And I really do think it built up such a great premise that I don't necessarily know if they knew how to stick the landing. A lot of the landing felt predictable. It felt like we knew where this film was going to go. It felt like the brutality itself, while yes, it was always consistently going, I almost wanted it to go further because it is such an intense film. I've heard a lot of people saying this is the most effed up film I've ever seen in my life. And I think it's one of the most effed up, like, American produced films I've seen. But like, if you compare this to some of the greatest like international works of horror, I think international horror, some of them go even further in their brutality, in their kind of extremity, to where this does feel like an extreme film for like a mainstream audience. But I really do think if you've seen so much horror, this may be a little underwhelming and maybe not as intense as you would have believed, because it kind of takes a predictable route and it becomes a little bit different than the film had set up itself to be. I think it's a really good concept, and a good concept can go a long way. It's just I don't know if the execution necessarily matched up, especially coming off of Possessor that I'm such a big fan of. But I think the performances here are the real standout and what are worth the ticket alone. And that is Alexander Skarsgård playing this man who is tortured, James Foster. He's an author. He's just kind of struggling to come to terms with his own life. And then when this whole wrench in his plans is shown and he gets this whole, introduction of this whole killing of the clone thing, it kind of shapes his perspective. And then you have Mia Goth playing kind of the, instigator. She's the one saying, no, do this, it's okay, like we'll still get away with all these things. Let's do all these criminal things because now we can get away with it and just have our clones killed. And you can see how like everything kind of consumes her as well, and she's giving 110% energy, kind of like we saw with Pearl and X. She's just giving 100 10%, and it really shows. She is someone that I'm really excited for in this genre, but just in general. Like, I'm excited to see her grow even more as a performer, because I was a fan of hers in the film Emma. I was a fan of hers in the film Suspiria, the Luca Guadagnino remake of it. So I'm really a fan of hers, and I can't wait to see her career continue to develop after things like this in Pearl, because she's becoming a modern day scream queen, and it's really exciting to see.
It's like a new skin working into place for you to complete your transformation.
So yeah, Infinity Pool is a mixed bag for me, but I still would recommend it because it's such an interesting premise alone. And all these films I would recommend for different things. M3GAN is something that I didn't love, but I still think I would recommend because it is a fun time, at least in the theater, and I think you're bound to get a few laughs out of it. Sick is a really slick, nice thriller slasher film that I think is a little underrated now. Skinamarink is just so inventive and new and unlike anything you'll ever see before. And if you do get nightmares, you can probably see a lot of that come to light. And then Infinity Pool, I think, has some great performances and a great concept. So I really do recommend these all. It was a strong year for January horror, and I do think that is kind of the main thesis of this video, is that January horror doesn't have to be a bad thing all the time. And in this case, the January horror we got was pretty damn solid. So if you want to check out the rest of the reviews this week, I'm doing catch up this week. So tomorrow I will be talking about a film similar to M3GAN in one of those like modern cult classic type films, Cocaine Bear, which was my most anticipated film for February. Then Wednesday we'll be talking about Creed 3. Thursday we will be talking about Scream 6, and Friday we'll be talking about Shazam: Fury of the Gods. And of course, I did want to thank my special thanks to all of these familiar names or non-familiar names. They're for all familiar names to me, who helped donate as part of the 24-hour subathon. Because they donated a certain amount, they will be sponsors essentially of this channel until the end of the year. So I'm putting their names here now to thank them for everything they do for the channel, in their support, in their commenting, in their sharing, and of course in their generous donations during the subathon. It does not go unnoticed, and here's your special shout out. So everyone, stay tuned for those reviews. I will see you next time. Thank you so much for watching.